So the mainstream approach to inflation, that is traditionally for the last several decades, since the 1970s, the mainstream economist will tell you too much government spending will cause inflation, right? Whether it's government subsidies or government contracts, you're just flooding the system with cash, giving people dollars to go out and shop and increase demand way beyond the capacity of the economy to keep up with it. So that causes inflation. Large government deficits. You have a lot of deficit hawks who oppose the idea of government deficits, and we hear quite a bit from them today. So I'm going to lay out a very counterintuitive statement that most mainstream economists, when they see this, their brains will short circuit. I'm arguing here that we can increase government spending, not decrease it, increase government spending to fight inflation. And from a mainstream perspective, what? This doesn't make any sense, because they argue the more government spending, the more inflation we have. As a matter of fact, most of the time, for most countries, the actual sources of inflation are way outside the jurisdiction of the central bank, which means they don't actually have the appropriate policy tools to target inflation. So for me, the focus should be on the actual sources of inflation pressure. Maybe the source of inflation is in housing, which is the case in the US. Maybe it's healthcare, maybe it's banking and finance. Depending on your diagnosis of the particular economy, then you target your strategy to tame the sources of inflation rather than just manipulate interest rates and blindly implement austerity across the board and kind of collective punishment for the whole economy in order to tame inflation. Because when you look at the cost of living for average families across the country and look at the composition of what people spend their money on, you notice that a big chunk of the spending for families with kids is childcare. Extremely expensive. Healthcare, extremely expensive. Housing, transportation, all of those sources of inflation. So let's say hypothetically, we're going to spend $10 billion on building green infrastructure. Let's say solar panels for a certain part of the country. And we're going to hire 100,000 people full-time to do this job of solarizing a particular region in the country and building the grid and so on, which is a great idea. That's infrastructure, right? So now those 100,000 people, we're going to pay them decent wages, and it's a free country. They're going to take their money and go out and spend. They're going to spend on food, on transportation, on housing, on childcare, across the system. And if they start spending in certain areas of the economy where we have those two sources of inflation, which is shortage of productive capacity, then we're going to see inflation. And if we have spending that's directed in areas that experience abusive price-setting behavior by key players, then we're also going to have inflation. What we should do is spend maybe $8 billion on solarizing part of the economy, and then the other $1 billion on building additional productive capacity in these other areas of the economy that experience those hotspots. Let's say shortage of affordable housing. Let's say shortage of public transportation, shortage of daycare facilities at affordable rates or subsidized rates. That's money well spent. This way, you're still spending the same $10 billion, but you're spending it in a way that kills the sources of inflation. And you also tax and regulate abusive market power, whether it's coming from real estate or finance or transportation, whatever that sector is. This way, the spending is actually improving quality of life and not leading to additional abuse of market power. So that's really the example. You can do this in any country and see that you can spend the same amount of money in a way that leads to inflation versus in a way that actually kills the sources of inflation. So it's not the dollar amount that triggers inflation, it's where and how you spend it.